im se svima, i malima i velikima, i bogatima i siromašnima, i slobodnjacima i robovima, dade žig na njihovu desnu ruku ili na čela njihova, te da nitko ne može ništa kupiti ili prodati, osim onoga ko ima žig ili ime zvijeri ili broj imena njezina.
Pozdrav dragi narode, dobrodošli u još jednu epizodu Slobodni. Današnja tema je Palestina, Izrael, Iran, Sjedinjene države. Ovo je tema kojom se do sada nisam bavio. Naime, nije jednostavno pronaći sugovornika koji je dovoljno dobro upućen, koji je dovoljno istražio, da je pritome još i dovoljno objektivno da objasni što se stvarnosti događa i na kraju da pristane da bude gost u mojoj emisiji. I evo uspio sam dobiti nekoga čiji rad već neko vrijeme pratim i koji objavljuje vrlo zanimljive članke upravo o ovim temama, točnije više o temi Palestine i Izraela i njihovog sukoba. Međutim, kako je aktualno ono što sad imamo, a to je rat u Iranu, i obzirom da će se ova emisija emitirati tek tjedan dana nakon što mi danas razgovaramo, pokušat ćemo bar o povijesti tog sukoba. Ali idemo na temu. Moj današnji gost, gospodin Jeremy Hammond. Hello, Jeremy. Welcome to our show in Croatia.
Hello. Thanks for having me on.
Can you say a few words about your background?
Sure. I got started doing independent journalism as a result of 9/11. I just was kind of naive at the time, and when the attacks occurred, I really genuinely wanted to know the answer to the question, why would people do this? And I was completely unsatisfied with the answer from the government that it's because they hate our freedom. So that kind of got me started on the path of doing my own research. And by the end of 2002, and it was clear that they were trying to use 9/11 as a pretext, along with other false pretexts to wage war on Iraq. And that's when I started writing articles and speaking out, trying to do what I could to try to stop that, and warning that the government was lying about Iraq's weapons of mass destruction. And that just kind of got me involved in analyzing U.S. foreign policy in the Middle East, and I took a special interest in, of course, the Israel-Palestine conflict as a result of that. Naturally, of course, Osama bin Laden, of course, citing the Israel-Palestine conflict as one of the reasons for Al-Qaeda's enmity towards the United States. And it was just kind of central to the whole Middle East. And of course, as one of the world's longest ongoing conflicts, it's just central to everything with U.S. foreign policy. So I took a great interest in that and started focusing on it very, very intently.
Before we continue with this conflict, we need to talk now a little about Iranian conflict, exactly war on Iran, which started a week ago. And we cannot make any forecast because things have changed from the week, and now it will change every day. But can you tell us what is the background exactly? What is history of this conflict?
Well, the conflict really goes back to, we can go back to 1953 with the nationalization of the oil company and the CIA MI6 coup to overthrow Mohammad Mossadegh and install the regime of the Shah. And then, of course, that ultimately led to the 1979 Islamic Revolution, overthrowing the Shah's regime. And ever since, of course, Iran has been, at the time, under the Shah, Iran was considered an ally of the U.S. The U.S., in fact, helped to build its nuclear program. And which, of course, Iran was one of the original signatories of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, the NPT, and has always been under the IAEA safeguards regime, the International Atomic Energy Agency. But after the Islamic Revolution, of course, Iran became an official enemy of the United States. And it's really just geopolitical. The regime in Iran has been seen as an obstacle to U.S. global military and dollar hegemony, essentially. And so that's kind of the U.S. Iran is essentially disobedient, and the United States has demanded that Iran not just give up a nuclear weapons program, which even the CIA, the intelligence community in the United States, which consists of multiple intelligence agencies, in 2007, they issued what's called a National Intelligence Estimate, acknowledging that there was no evidence that Iran had an active nuclear weapons program. They claimed that Iran was working on nuclear weapons in the past, but that ended in 2003. And that has remained the intelligence assessment ever since. We had last year in June or July, I believe it was, Donald Trump's national intelligence director, Tulsi Gabbard, said once more, just reaffirmed that intelligence assessment that there's no evidence that Iran is actively working on nuclear weapons. But of course, the United States has had sanctions on Iran, and why is that? Well, under the Obama administration, they had an agreement to the JCPOA, the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, something like, I forget what that stands for exactly. But they had this agreement to essentially enforce a very strict IAEA safeguards regime, where Iran was very limited in the level of enrichment it could do with uranium enrichment, how much it could stockpile. It was a very strict regime. Iran was agreeing to it and was complying with it. Of course, Donald Trump, during his first term, withdrew from that, violated it, and reimposed sanctions in violation of that agreement, for the simple reason that the view of the Trump administration, as with prior administrations, is not only that Iran can't enrich uranium to weapons grade for nuclear weapons, which of course is prohibited, but that Iran can't enrich uranium at all, even for civilian purposes. Now, this is completely against the NPT treaty, which explicitly recognizes the right of nations to enrich uranium for civilian purposes, in other words, for nuclear energy, which the evidence indicates that's all Iran has been doing. It hasn't been enriching to weapons grade, and it's not, even the U.S. intelligence community assesses that Iran has no nuclear weapons program. So it's all about Iran being disobedient to this demand and this ultimatum to cease enrichment altogether, even though it has a right to do that under the treaty. And so it's this disobedience, this refusal to submit to Washington's dictates. And then, of course, also this ties into the U.S. alliance in partnership with Israel. And of course, Israel views Iran as an obstacle to continued takeover of Palestinian land in the West Bank, Gaza, and expulsion or extermination of its people. Because of course, Iran, is partnered with Hezbollah in Lebanon, supports Hamas, and so this is viewed as an obstacle to Israel's aims in the Palestinian territories. And so you have these two kind of major factors where the U.S. has its own geopolitical goals with Iran, and then of course being partnered with Israel, and Israel has its own goals. And so you have a situation where Netanyahu and Trump, Israeli intelligence had information about top leadership in Iran being in a certain location at a certain time. And so they saw an opportunity to strike Iran and take out its top leadership, including Ayatollah Ali Khamenei. And so there was a phone call, as reported, between Netanyahu and Trump. And so Trump decided to join with Iran in going ahead and waging war against Iran and striking and decapitating its leadership with this initial strike. And the claim is that there's basically three claims that they try to justify this attack. One is that Iran supports terrorism. The other is that Iran is developing nuclear weapons, which I've already discussed, that there's no intelligence, there's no evidence for that. And the third is that Iran is brutalizing its own people in its oppressive regime. Well, none of those pretexts can possibly be true, because the U.S. and Israel themselves, their crimes, war crimes, crimes against humanity, and terrorism far outweigh anything Iran is responsible for, including Israel's response to the Hamas 10/7 attacks, the October 7th, 2023 attacks. And Israel's response to that has been genocidal, absolute devastation in Gaza. And that crime far outweighs, it's on a far greater scale than anything Hamas was ever capable of or has ever perpetrated. And of course, international aggression is, as defined at the Nuremberg Tribunal, the supreme international crime. So aggression itself is a crime. So you can't uphold international law and fight against criminal violence with criminal violence. This is just a logical impossibility. And the third justification that I mentioned, that Iran is an oppressive regime brutalizing its own people. Well, they're citing the protests that occurred earlier this year, in which thousands of people were killed. And so Iran's point of view on that is that there were terrorists embedded amongst the protesters and causing violence. And there's definitely some evidence to suggest that that narrative has truth to it. Maybe Iran has exaggerated, but certainly Israel's Mossad intelligence agency, according to its Farsi X account on, formerly Twitter, said that we're on the ground with the protesters. You had U.S. officials saying things like that that Israel's Mossad was working alongside the protesters. So, in other words, the goal seems to have been to hijack these protests and to fuel violence in order to provoke the Iranian government into a harsher crackdown on the protesters, which succeeded. And so then now they cite that as a pretext to attack Iran. However, it can't logically be true that the U.S. government and the Trump administration is concerned about the Iranian people, because if they were concerned about the Iranian people, they wouldn't have imposed crippling sanctions on Iran, targeting the civilian population. And in fact, you had Trump's Treasury Secretary bragging about how the crippling sanctions had destroyed Iran's economy so badly that he took credit for the protests, because, of course, the protests were against the economic devastation. And so you have the U.S. government taking credit for the protests based on the fact that their sanctions were so crippling. So, of course, if the U.S. government cared about the Iranian people, it wouldn't be imposing a policy of collective punishment against the civilian population of Iran. So those three pretexts are obviously false. And so we know that there are other geopolitical reasons for this war.
Yeah, before we come to these geopolitical reasons, just one question concerning Iran. They are theocracy and they are imposing Sharia law. And according to this law, people doesn't have civil rights as in the West. How can you explain? They said even that even more than 80% of people are not supporting this government. And is this true? And what is the real situation concerning this civil rights in Iran?
Well, I'm not an expert on Iran and its internal affairs. So I guess I can't answer that question. I don't know exactly. I don't know. I would imagine, I don't have statistics on it, but I would imagine that a huge amount of the population is not happy with the government there, because it is an oppressive regime. There's no doubt about that. And then we also saw, going back to 2009, there were major protests during the 2009 election in Iran. President Mahmoud Ahmadinejad won the election. And once again, in that situation, you had a situation where there was a lot of external foreign interference and propaganda designed to make people think that Ahmadinejad had stolen the election, when actually all the evidence indicated that he legitimately won. But they were trying to fuel these protests against the government. And that was largely effective at the time. And of course, Western media propagated this false claim that he had stolen the election, when there was no evidence really to support that. And all the indications were that he did legitimately win the election. But there were mass protests, and it was a mass uprising, and it was a grassroots uprising. But then again, you have foreign elements kind of hijacking that movement. But that's an indication of, there are a lot of unrest in the country and a lot of opposition to the regime. So certainly, I think there is a lot of popular opposition to the government there, and understandably so. And then, of course, you have exile organizations and organizations here in the United States that, for example, are pro-democracy, pro-human rights, and yes, they want a new government in Iran. They want democratic reform. They want to see democracy, but they're not, in favor of this violent type of regime change operation. The National Iranian American Council, NIAC, is the one that comes to mind. And so, organizations like that would probably have a lot of data about, public opinion in Iran, and be able to answer that question. But you do have organizations like that they want peaceful relations between Iran and the United States, and I favor that too. I don't see any reason why Iran needs to be considered an enemy. Its nuclear program is under the IAEA safeguards regime, and they don't learn the lesson from Iraq, because in 1981, Israel bombed Iraq's Osirik nuclear reactor, and the pretext for that was, they need to stop Saddam Hussein from developing nuclear weapons, so they destroyed the reactor. However, that didn't stop Iraq from seeking nuclear weapons. In fact, it prompted Saddam Hussein to want to develop nuclear weapons. It's what precipitated Saddam Hussein's goal of developing nuclear weapons in order to have a deterrent to stop any further Israeli aggression. So if anything, these actions are not going to prevent Iran from developing nuclear weapons. There was already no evidence that it has an active nuclear weapons program. If anything, it's just going to encourage and motivate Iran to try to develop nuclear weapons to stop further attacks like this from the U.S. and Israel in the future.
What do you think?
What
do you think? What is the geopolitical reason that USA attacked Iran exactly? You said there was a phone call between Netanyahu and Trump, and then Trump decided to join this attack on Iran.
Yeah, well, we've seen, during the genocide in Gaza, we've seen attacks on U.S. forces in the Middle East. We've seen, and then, of course, during the June war last year, when the U.S. and Israel launched airstrikes in Iran to destroy its nuclear program. Of course, Iran retaliated against U.S. bases in the Middle East. And so there was also this foreknowledge in the U.S. government that that Israel was intending to launch this strike to take out the leadership in Iran. And I mean, the United States could have stopped that easily by just saying, no, we're not going to greenlight that. You're not going to do that. And of course, the U.S. has great leverage over Israeli policies because of all the billions in military aid provided to Israel, which anytime the United States government wants to stop Israel from perpetrating violations of international law, it could simply say, we're going to cut off this military aid. But of course, the United States never does that. So it could have stopped it. But instead, Trump got on board with this plan and jointly joined this operation with Israel to launch this war. And you had Marco Rubio, Donald Trump's Secretary of State, openly telling reporters that, well, we decided to launch this war because we knew if Israel attacked Iran, then Iran would also retaliate against our forces in the Middle East. So we would have taken higher casualties in that situation. So we're acting preemptively, is what he said, to ensure that we have lower casualties and that we can take out Iran's missiles so that it can't retaliate against us in response to this attack. So, I mean, this is the situation that you have where it's just brazen criminal aggression against Iran, complete violation it's a violation of the U.S. Constitution. And it's a violation of the UN treaty, which prohibits the threat or use of force in international affairs, except in cases of self-defense against aggression. Well, here they're openly admitting that, no, we attacked Iran because we knew that Israel was going to attack Iran. So there's not even a claim of self-defense in this situation. And so, of course, this is a crime of aggression under international law.
Well, for sure, this war has a lot to do with a conflict in Palestine. We need to explain to our audience. Some of them doesn't know what is the history, and let's explain because you explain it in your website in details. And we need to start with this UN Declaration 181. Can you say, people, what happened, what was in this declaration, and how everything started?
Yeah, so the United Nations essentially took over. After World War I, you had what was called the Palestine Mandate under the League of Nations, which essentially gave the color of law to Great Britain's belligerent occupation of Palestine, which essentially was aimed at preventing the people of Palestine from being able to exercise self-determination and in violation of a promise given to the Arab peoples during the war, that the British promised in support for the war effort to support independence of the Arab states from the Ottoman Empire. And of course, however, they reneged on that promise in the case of Palestine, and they enforced this occupation of Palestine aimed at supporting the Zionist project, the settler colonial project, to transform Palestine from an Arab territory into a demographically Jewish state. And so you had after the League of Nations was dissolved and the UN essentially took over that mandate system, and the British kind of wanted out by that time, and they kind of wanted to just leave. And there was an expiration of the mandate on May 14th, 1948, May 15th, perhaps, 1948. And so they went to the United Nations and they asked the United Nations to basically take over responsibility for this and come up with a plan, like a transition, to be able to allow Great Britain to just end the occupation and leave. And so there was something called the UNSCOP, UNSCOP, the UN Special Committee on Palestine, was formed to try to come up with a plan. And so they came up with the famous or infamous partition plan, where the majority of that committee recommended that Palestine be partitioned to separate Jewish and Arab states. And there was a minority in that committee that objected to that, and they argued that this plan is actually a violation of the UN Charter because it's grossly prejudicial to the rights of the Palestinians. And so the situation was that they were proposing that more than half of the territory of Palestine be assigned to the Jewish state and less than half be assigned to the Arab state, even though at the time the Jewish community only owned about 7% of the land in Palestine, and Arabs owned more, Arabs being the majority in the country, owned more land in every single district in Palestine. So it was grossly prejudicial and inequitable. And so the Arabs rightly rejected this plan. But what happened was UNSCOP proposed the partition plan, and the United Nations General Assembly on November 29th, 1947, in Resolution 181, endorsed the partition plan. So they recommended that the partition plan be considered by the UN Security Council. It did go to the Security Council, and that's where it died. And you had the U.S. ambassador to the United Nations explaining why it died. It was because that the United Nations has no authority to partition Palestine against the will of the majority of its inhabitants. And the UN had no authority. The UN just had no authority to be able to do that. And so the partition plan died. But the problem is that it's become mythologized in what people think of as history. So there's this popular myth that the UN created Palestine. You can read it quite commonly. The UN created Palestine, created Israel. But that's just not true. It's not true for two reasons. So number one, the UN Resolution 181, number one, it was a General Assembly resolution, which General Assembly resolutions are non-binding. Security Council resolutions are binding on member states. The UNGA resolutions are not. So it was a non-binding resolution. It was just a recommendation for the UN Security Council to take it up and examine it and make a decision about it, and it died there. And so the partition resolution neither created Israel and Palestine, and it neither partitioned Palestine legally, nor conferred any legal authority to the Zionist leadership for their unilateral declaration of the existence of the State of Israel on May 14th, 1948. And so the partition resolution was, again, in November of 1947, but it wasn't until May 14th, 1948, that the Zionist leadership declared what they call their Declaration of Independence. However, the Jewish community had no sovereignty over most of the territory that they were claiming was now the State of Israel. They had no legitimacy for that declaration, but they cited UN Resolution 181 as though it provided legal authority for that declaration. It did not. And so this is a really important point, I think, to emphasize, is that the UN did not create Israel, and it also did not give any legitimacy to that unilateral declaration.
Then what happened next? You need to explain also how this Zionist movement started and who was behind it and who was financing this all this last century.
Well, sure. This goes back to the Balfour Declaration of 1917, when the British Foreign Minister, wrote a letter to Lord Lionel Walter Rothschild, from the famous banking family, expressing support for the Zionist project. It's not a coincidence that that letter was written to a Rothschild, a banker. So there were basically three primary reasons for this British policy of supporting Zionism. So the first one was to gain Jewish support for the war effort from the Jewish bankers, the Rothschilds. And the second was they wanted to establish essentially a military base in the Middle East, a partner regime in that location to basically secure their interests with the Suez Canal. And so just having a military foothold in Palestine, it kind of gave them proximity to the Suez Canal to be able to protect their interests in the Middle East. And the third was European anti-Semitism. So after World War II and the Holocaust, European countries were fine with Jewish refugees leaving Europe to go to Palestine, which historically Palestine had been essentially a refuge for Jews, especially compared to rampant anti-Semitism in Europe. And so you had Christians and Muslims and Jews living in Palestine with friendly relations under the Ottoman Empire. But what happened was as soon as the Zionist project was adopted as a policy by the British, and they essentially enforced this occupation after World War I of Palestine, and so allowing Jewish immigration into the countries, and so the Jewish population rapidly expanded during those years. And of course, this was troubling to the Arabs, not because of any inherent anti-Semitism in Palestine, but because they understood what the Zionist project was aimed at doing, which was to ultimately dispossess them and displace them. They were being denied the right to self-determination because what they wanted their independence. That was what they were promised, that once the Ottoman Empire was dissolved, that they would be given their independence. And so that's what they were demanding. And instead they were being told, well, no, we can have democracy in this territory, but only after Jews become a majority, and then there can be democracy, right? That was essentially what they were being told. And so they understood what was happening. And so this was the cause of the unrest. In fact, you had outbreaks of violence, 1920, 1921, 1929. There were major outbreaks of violence. And so the British had commissions of inquiry looking at those outbreaks of violence and asking the question, what is the root cause of this violence? And in each instance, they determined that it wasn't any kind of like inherent anti-Semitism, that the Arabs living, the Arab Palestinians would welcome Jews with open arms into the country. They could bring capital from Europe. They could help develop the country. But the Zionist organization had very prejudicial policies. For example, that they would buy land from absentee landlords under feudalistic, taking advantage of feudalistic Ottoman land laws that deprived the rightful inhabitants and homesteaders of the land of their property. And all the land that it would acquire through these types of purchases, it would never allow any employment of Arabs on the land. And this was starkly contrasted with there was another organization called the Palestine Colonization Association, and it had different policies where they were friendly with the Arabs, and so you would have like Jewish landowners who would employ Arab workers. And the British would comment about this in their reports and say how when you go through those colonies, and you can see Arabs sitting on the porch of the Jew with hanging, being friendly with the Jews in those colonies. They had good relationships, whereas in the Zionist organization colonies, it was a completely different situation where it was causing all of this resentment toward the Jewish community because their policies were very anti-Arab, and of course you even had whole villages were essentially expelled under these types of land purchases. And so it was a situation where the Arabs understood what the Zionist organization was all about. And then in 1937, you had what was called the Peel Commission report, where the British essentially endorsed what they called compulsory transfer of population. In other words, they were going to force have a forced exchange of population, where a few thousand Jews would have to leave territory that would become it was kind of the earliest form of the partition plan, where they envisioned two different states, and then to solve the demographic problems, a few thousand Jews would have to be forced out of the Arab state, but many hundreds of thousands of Arabs would have to be forcibly removed from the Jewish state. And so when the British essentially endorsed that concept, from that point on, the Zionist leadership was open about their intent they were openly in favor of this idea of what they called compulsory transfer. and which essentially is ethnic cleansing. That's how we would describe it today, which is a crime against humanity. And so what happened was you had outbreaks of violence after the partition plan resolution was passed. Essentially, Palestine fell into chaos and outbreaks of violence. And there's this is another myth that what happened was that you had Israel was established and created, and as a consequence of that, you had neighboring Arab states militarily invade and to try to wipe the newly created state of Israel off the map. This is not what happened. So before May 14th, Israel was already on the offensive with military operations. In fact, in April of 1948, according to Israeli historian Benny Morris, he described it as Israel, the Zionists, quote, war of conquest, end quote. So it's the war of conquest. So they were already on the offensive, trying to conquer land. And this involved ethnic cleansing operations where they would cleanse villages of their inhabitants. And one of the ways that they would do this was just mass terrorization and mass terror, causing this mass flight of civilians out of the territories that the Zionists then militarily conquered. And so Israel was established through this ethnic cleansing. And by the time of the unilateral declaration of May 14th, you had 250,000 Arabs had already been ethnically cleansed from their homes. And so when the neighboring Arab states militarily intervened, they intervened into Palestine to try to stop these ethnic cleansing operations, but they didn't really have very much success with that. You had Egypt managed to hang on to the Gaza Strip, and Jordan managed to hang on to the West Bank. And so Israel, the Zionist forces expanded beyond what the partition plan had recommended for the Jewish state, and took over most of the territory of Palestine, leaving the Palestinians with just like 22% of their historic homeland. And so that was how Israel was established. It was through force and ethnic cleansing.
You mentioned a few times genocide and ethnic cleansing. Is this political statement, or there is any legal decision that confirms that?
Well, ethnic cleansing is actually not legally defined under international law, but it would be defined as, a forced transfer of population or forced expulsion of populations. So the term ethnic cleansing that's what it refers to. It's just a forced expulsion of a population. So there's no actual definition of ethnic cleansing under international law, but it's just become popularized as a term to describe like forced expulsion of the populations. However, genocide does have an international a definition under international law. There's the 1948 Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide, which does define it. And then also in the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court, the ICC, they've adopted that exact same definition. So both of those international treaties define genocide essentially as the actions intended to destroy a people as a people, which could include, mass killings or imposing conditions on a population designed to bring about its destruction, death, designed to bring about prevention of births, these types of conditions, essentially to destroy a people as a people. That's what genocide is. And of course, we've seen in the situation in Gaza, a policy of depriving the civilian population of goods and services necessary for survival. When you deprive a population of food and water and fuel, with this intent of depriving them of things that they need for survival, that's very clear intent. You have the government of South Africa bringing a case to the International Court of Justice, the ICJ, accusing Israel of genocide, citing with several pages of just citing Israeli leaders expressing genocidal intent toward the Palestinians, and then, of course, documenting various, the indiscriminate attacks, the systematic targeting of Gaza's healthcare system, for example. So genocide does have a very clear definition under international law, and that case is ongoing, of course. And then you also have the International Criminal Court, the ICC, has issued an arrest warrant for Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, as well as his former defense minister. He's wanted for war crimes and crimes against humanity for the situation in Gaza. So of course, there isn't a court case I can point to and say, well, under this case, it was determined that yes, Israel was created through ethnic cleansing in 1948. I can't cite a court case on that, but we have the documentary history, and we have the documentary record, and so we can say with absolute confidence that what happened was clearly ethnic cleansing. That they have all the kinds of myths that the people left voluntarily. Well, this is completely false. In fact, we can even turn to the IDF's, the Israeli Defense Force's own intelligence documents from the time, where they did their own internal assessment of the causes of the flight of the Palestinians, and they determined, for example, there's this claim that the Arab leaders told them to leave. So they did. They were just following orders from the Arab leadership. And this IDF intelligence document says, there were some instances where Israeli leaders would tell the people to flee, but that's because there was this violence happening, and so they were just telling people to flee for their own safety. And of course, people were expecting to be able to return to their homes, but for the most part, actually, the Arab leadership was trying to convince people not to flee because they saw this mass flight, and they kept trying to tell the Palestinian people, "No, you need to go back to your homes." Especially, they wanted the younger men to go back into the front lines and help defend the territory against the Zionist war of conquest. And so the IDF itself attributed most of the flight to the actions of itself, of the IDF, which previously was the Haganah, and then once Israel declared its independence or declared the state of Israel, became the IDF, and then working alongside of Jewish terrorist organizations who were terrorizing, as I mentioned earlier, like systematically terrorizing villages into flight. And so they took credit for most of the flight themselves. And so there's a lot of myths about that. I mean, it was not a voluntary migration. These people were expelled. And of course, then they wanted to go back to their homes, and Israel has never allowed them to go back to their homes. And that's why we have this the Palestinian refugee crisis problem today, because they were never allowed to return to their homes. And Israel made sure that the Zionists made sure that they would not be able to return to their homes by systematically wiping hundreds of villages right off the map and building Jewish towns in their place. And so it was a very clear case of ethnic cleansing. That's what we would call it today. We would say that was ethnic cleansing.
How came in this picture came Hezbollah and Hamas? And also very important thing, what is the role of United States of America and his policies according to this Israel state?
Yeah, so Hamas really is a creature of Israel's own creation. It going back into the 70s, you had its founder, Sheikh Yassin, who ran what was considered a charity organization, doing things like supporting clinics and schools and things like this. But he was heavily influenced by the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt. And then they basically established Hamas, grew out of that, and with its charter in 1988, declaring essentially that it wanted to liberate Palestine from the Zionist regime. And so, of course, Israel, you would think that Israel would view Hamas, therefore, as an enemy, but in fact, Israel essentially not only tolerated Hamas, but it tried to utilize Hamas strategically as a counterforce to the PLO, the Palestine Liberation Organization, under Yasser Arafat, because PLO posed a threat of peace because it had renounced terrorism, and they had officially accepted the two-state solution to the conflict, grounded in UN Resolution 242 from 1967, which was a Security Council resolution calling on Israel to withdraw its forces after the 1967 war to the positions it held before its surprise attack on Egypt on June 5th, which is how the war started. Which were the same as the armistice lines of 1949. At the end of the 1948 war, they drew armistice lines. So those are sometimes called the 1949 armistice lines. Sometimes they're called the 1967 lines. Sometimes they're called the green line because that's the color with which it was drawn on the map. These all mean the same thing. And so Israel was called on to withdraw its forces, and it's been in violation of that resolution ever since. It's refused to withdraw from the occupied Palestinian territories of the West Bank and Gaza. And so when PLO accepted the two-state solution based on Resolution 242, that posed a threat to Israel. It posed a threat of peace because Israel essentially needed acts of terrorism and violence to continue justifying its occupation and its brutal oppression of the Palestinian people. And so it utilized Hamas as a strategic ally against to divide the leadership of the Palestinians, and to use it essentially as a counterforce against the PLO. Now, you had within Hamas, you had, of course, in the early 90s, you had suicide bombings. The first suicide bombing was a response to a Jewish terrorist who had killed dozens of people at a mosque. And then the retaliation for that was a suicide bombing, the first ever that Hamas was responsible for. But you did have, within Hamas, you had moderation, and a movement towards, a movement away from armed resistance and armed conflict and armed violence toward engagement in the political process and diplomacy. For example, you had Sheikh Yassin saying in 2005, he issued a statement saying that we would be willing to accept a long-term truce with Israel, with a withdrawal of forces to the 1967 lines, and then, we would be willing to accept a Palestinian state alongside Israel along those borders. And Israel's response to that, instead of encouraging this moderation of Hamas and this move toward a diplomatic settlement, Israel's response was to assassinate him. So, of course, this was a recurring pattern where anytime there was any movement towards moderation of Hamas, Israel would act to eliminate that leadership and ensure that the most radical, violent people within that organization became the heads of the organization. And so it really provoked more violence and more terrorism throughout Hamas's history. And then again, under Netanyahu, you had Benjamin Netanyahu during his term as prime minister was utilizing Hamas as a strategic ally, specifically with the purpose to keep the leadership divided between Hamas in Gaza and the PLO in the West Bank, and to prevent any movement towards peace negotiations with the Palestinians. So this was a very deliberate policy of essentially partnering with Hamas in that strategic sense, and including allowing funding of Hamas from Qatar, and in funneling this money from Qatar to Hamas in Gaza. This was an open policy, and so essentially the 10/7 attacks, October 7th, 2023, was really blowback for Netanyahu's policy. And in Israel, it was very openly. You can read the media there. In the United States, there was barely any mention of this policy. You had Tom Friedman mentioning it once or twice in the New York Times, but it was almost never mentioned. But in Israel, you could go and read like Haaretz or Times of Israel or Jerusalem Post, and it just openly acknowledged that this was his policy. And the Israelis were outraged about when 10/7 happened, because they largely blamed Netanyahu for those attacks because of his policy of utilizing Hamas as a strategic ally. And so that was the situation.
I need to ask you something concerning this terrorist attack on 7th of October 2023. Let's imagine that you are in charge in Israel in that moment. What do you think what will be the best reaction or response on this terrorist attack, what was really terrible?
What would be the best response? Well, I can tell you what I wouldn't have done, because what they, I suppose I would immediately organize the military to put up a defense. However, the military was in chaos on that morning, and they ended up, I don't know whether out of panic or there were orders given, but it seems that essentially something called the Hannibal Directive was implemented, which is where they were willing to sacrifice their own citizens to take out the terrorists. And so you had a situation where there was this indiscriminate attacks. And so there were cases where, for example, one of the famous cases is there was a house where Israeli civilians were being held hostage by some Hamas members. And the response was to just blow up the house. And so tank munitions were fired into the house. And I think it was 12 Israeli civilians were killed in that attack, around a dozen. And then, of course, you had there would be Apache helicopters that were firing on cars fleeing back into Gaza. And so they had no knowledge of whether there were Israeli civilians being held hostage in those vehicles, but they were just taking out the vehicles regardless of the risk to their own citizens. So this is one of the controversies about what happened on that day, is that there's an indication that some, if not many, of the Israeli civilians who were killed were actually killed by their own forces. And I guess what I would have done if I was in charge of the military leadership, of course, if I was in charge, I would not have created the situation in the first place. I mean, you had a situation where Gaza was, as the former head of the National Security Council called it, a huge concentration camp. So after Hamas, again, in 2005, 2006, Hamas was involved in elections, municipal elections, and then legislative elections. And then it came to power. So you had a Hamas-led government after it won legislative elections in 2006. So it became essentially the dominant force within the Palestinian Authority, the PA, which is a sub-agency of the PLO established under the Oslo Accords. And so you had a Hamas-led government in the occupied territories. And Israel and the U.S.'s response to that was essentially to try to collude with Fatah, which is Mahmoud Abbas's, the president of the PLO, the PA, his party. So they had this collusion between the Fatah and Israel and the United States to essentially try to overthrow the Hamas-led government. And so you had a counter coup where Hamas and it basically expelled Fatah from the Gaza Strip. And that's why there was this division of leadership, where you still have Abbas, whose term expired in 2009 in the West Bank, where you had Hamas government in Gaza. And that's why the leadership was divided. And so their coup attempt failed, and Hamas fought back and took over control of the Strip. And then Israel responded further by imposing a blockade of Gaza. Of course, Gaza has been under blockade since 1967, but they escalated the siege of Gaza and strictly limited what was allowed into the Strip, again, to collectively punish the civilian population of Gaza. And so Gaza had been under this blockade for a long time, for many years. And even before that is what Giora Island, the former National Security Council head of in Israel, described as a huge concentration camp. And that's, I think, an accurate and fair description of what Gaza became. And so you had a situation where, of course, if you're going to brutalize and oppress people like that, well, you're going to fuel violence and you're going to inspire terrorism. It doesn't justify it. But then, of course, the 10/7 attacks also don't justify Israel's response of launching a genocidal assault on Gaza, collectively, again, completely laying siege to the territory, blocking food, blocking humanitarian aid, systematically targeting the healthcare system. The violence doesn't justify violence. I mean, there's the only legitimate use of force is in self-defense, and of course, the Israeli armed forces had every right to engage in self-defense on 10/7 and try to protect their citizens. But the response to that of indiscriminately bombing Gaza, of course, is completely unjustified.
We could discuss about this topic for a long time because it's huge, but for the end, we need to say about the role of United States. That means what is policy of United States according to Israel, and what do you think about this present plan and present peace agreement, what is already violated, but I heard, but this Trump agreement, what are your thoughts about this?
Well, the U.S. policy pretty much forever has been to support Israel. The U.S. government was one of the first countries on May 14th, 1948, when the Zionists unilaterally declared the existence of Israel. Within 15 minutes of that, President Truman officially recognized that state with great prejudice to the indigenous Arab inhabitants of Palestine. Because again, the declaration did not define the borders of this new state of Israel. And so the implication was we're declaring sovereignty over all of Palestine. And again, there was no legal force behind that unilateral declaration, and it had no legitimacy because the Zionists, the Jewish community, weren't sovereign over most of Arab Palestine. And so that was an early example of the U.S. prejudice against the Palestinians and in favor of Israel. And then really in 1967, you had a situation where the U.S. intelligence community had anticipated that war was going to outbreak, It warned, the CIA warned President Johnson, well, if war outbreaks, it's going to be started by Israel, but Israel has vast qualitative military edge and will defeat the combined Arab armies within a couple of weeks. That proved accurate, except it wasn't a couple of weeks, it was 6 days, and that's why it's called the 6-Day War. So that was really when the floodgates were opened in terms of U.S. support for Israel, and really from that point forward, you have a lot of talk about the two-state solution from that point, which really is grounded in that Resolution 242 that called for a withdrawal of forces to the 1967 lines, as they're sometimes called, to the armistice lines. Excuse me. And the idea was that you would have a Palestinian state in Gaza in the West Bank, with East Jerusalem as its capital. East Jerusalem is also occupied Palestinian territory, and then Israel would be withdraw to those borders. So that's essentially the two-state solution. And so the PLO, again, from the mid-'70s onward, had accepted the two-state solution. Officially did so in 1988. And then you had what's called, the so-called peace process. But the peace process was always aimed at essentially blocking implementation of the two-state solution. And this is one of the key things that people are really confused about in this history, because they equate the two-state, they equate the peace process with the goal of establishing two states. But the two-state solution, grounded in UN Resolution 242, is premised on the applicability of international law to the conflict. Hence, the necessary withdrawal of Israeli forces, because as the preamble to that resolution states, that the acquisition of territory by war is inadmissible under international law. Therefore, Israel is required to withdraw. But Israel has its own unilateral interpretation of that resolution, where it argues, well, we don't have to withdraw our forces until there's a peace agreement, which is not what the resolution says. It's not what the intent of the Security Council was. But that unilateral interpretation of the resolution of Israel's is what became the foundation for the peace process. So whereas the two-state solution is grounded in the applicability of international law to the conflict, the peace process was grounded in a rejection of the applicability of international law to the conflict. So no longer was Israel required to withdraw, but now the people living under its military occupation were forced to negotiate with their oppressors over how much of their own land they could continue to live in, and maybe someday exercise some kind of limited autonomy over. And that's what the peace process was all about. And so it was essentially an endorsement of Israel's occupation, and it was aimed at blocking implementation of the two-state solution to perpetuate Israel's occupation and settlement regime. And so this has been the U.S. government's role in the Israel-Palestine conflict, is essentially just supporting this Zionist regime with great prejudice towards the indigenous and Arab inhabitants of that land. And so, coming to, of course, after 10/7 in 2023, you had Israel's genocidal response. The Biden administration fully supported Israel's genocide. The Trump administration predictably continued that policy, escalated that policy. When Donald Trump came into office, there was a ceasefire in place. The day before his inauguration, it was announced that Hamas and Israel had agreed to a ceasefire. And the first stage of that ceasefire was that Hamas would release a certain number of Israeli hostages, and Israel was going to ease the siege, allow in trucks with humanitarian aid, open the crossings, and of course the hostilities were supposed to cease. Well, Donald Trump encouraged Israel to renege its agreement with Hamas. And so Trump sent a message to Israel saying, you don't need to uphold your end of the bargain. All you need to do is issue an ultimatum to Hamas to release all Israeli hostages now. And if not, we're just going to resume the use of force. And so that's exactly what Israel did. On March 2nd, it had reimposed a complete siege of Gaza, blocking all humanitarian aid, which is a violation of the ceasefire agreement. And then on March 18th, it had launched renewed airstrikes in Gaza. The first airstrike killed hundreds of civilians in a refugee camp, including many children. And it just resumed its genocidal assault on Gaza with Trump's encouragement. So Trump is beyond complicit in the genocide. He's actually a perpetrator of genocide in Gaza himself as a result of his role, not just facilitating it and arming it and funding Israel and encouraging it, but going so far as to actually give Israel the excuse to do that with full U.S. support. That to me, that goes beyond mere complicity to participation. And so Democrats, Republicans, right across the board, the U.S. policy remains the same. It remains to support Israel's oppression of the Palestinians and its crimes against the Palestinian people. And so this is the role of the United States government.
Yeah. Well, you're not sound very optimistic for the future. You're writing in detail in your blog, exactly in your webpage. Can you say where people can find you and read your articles?
Yeah, sure. My website is jeremyrhammond.com. So it's got my middle initial there, the R, so jeremyrhammond.com. And I've got a free newsletter people can sign up for to stay updated with my work. I do a lot of work. I write about foreign policy issues, also domestic public health policy issues and economic policies. So I cover a kind of a broad range of different topics. And so that's the best way to stay updated with my work is to subscribe to my free newsletters at jeremyrhammond.com.
Thank you, Jeremy. Thank you for your work, and thank you for accepting this show.
Well, I appreciate it. Thank you.
Evo, dragi narode, kao što i uvijek pokušavam, tako i sada. Kada je bilo koja tema u pitanju, prvo što pokušam razumjeti temu. Da bi je razumjeli, morate puno više znati o njoj. Morate znati povijest, kako je nastala, u kojim okolnostima, što se događalo u međuvremenu. I na kraju ništa se ne smije izvaditi iz konteksta. Ono što doživljavamo redovito, prvenstveno putem medija, jeste da se zauzimaju strane iz pozicije zauzete strane, zalaganja za jednu ili za drugu stranu, se subjektivno osuđuje, odlučuje i na kraju zaključuje tko je pravo, a tko nije. Moj zadatak i na kraju ono što sam ja zamislio jeste da pokušam što većem broju ljudi od vas koji niste upućeni u ovu tematiku, nego slušate usput ili slušate od medija što se događa, da razumijete što se dogodilo, kako je nastala povijest toga. Također da otvorim pitanja ona koja su i sa druge strane, dakle jedne i druge strane postavljena, da se o njima razgovara, da se razumije, da bi na kraju ipak možda uspjeli zauzeti neki stav. Naša sreća je da se ovakve stvari, kao što smo sad danas čuli, ne događaju na našem području, ali i mi imamo tešku povijest i mi imamo povijesne teme koje još uvijek nismo raščistili i pitanje je kada ćemo i da li ćemo ih raščistiti. Tako i u ovom slučaju ti konflikti traju dugi niz desetljeća i nažalost još uvijek nisu riješeni. Ja ću pokušati u što većem broju gostiju dovesti da se razgovara o tome, da vas upoznam s tim, ne da bi ja donio neki zaključak ili sud, jer nije na meni da sudim, nego da vam donio informaciju koju, vjerujem, ne možete dobiti od onih koji vam stvarno trebaju dati, a to su naši mediji i na kraju krajeva službeni izvori koji bi trebali suditi po povijesti i po činjenicama, a ne po nekoj preferenciji što nažalost uvijek doživljavamo. Ne znamo što će biti do emitiranja ove emisije sa aktualnim ratom u Iranu, a nadam se da ono što smo danas govorili će biti dovoljno za razumjeti i taj problem i da na kraju sami donesete svoje sudove. Hvala lijepo na pažnji i uskoro se vidimo u sljedećoj epizodi Slobodni.
Nitko vas neće natjerati da se poklonite zvijeri, učinit ćete to svoje voljom, odbacujući vjeru. Bićete laka meta za zvijeri, jer se niste podredili vjeri. Ako se ne podredite vjeri, podredit ćete se zvijeri. Toliko ćete se suobličiti sa ovim svijetom, da nećete ni prepoznati da ste u zabludi. Biće to najveća demonska prevara ikada i pravedno zaslužena osuda nad nepokajanim grešnicima.
Gdje su svi oni koji su nas